The cold in Silver Creek, Oregon, isn't just a temperature. It's a weight that settles in your bones, especially on a gray Wednesday in the middle of November. I stood outside the iron gates of the Silver Creek funeral home, the rain coming down in a steady, rhythmic needle prick that soaked through my cheap black coat and turned the hem of my dress into a heavy, sodden anchor. Through the thick mist and the towering pines, the manor-style building looked like a fortress, a place where secrets were kept under lock and key, much like the life I had once lived within its walls. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. At the entrance, my brother Tristan stood like a sentry, flanking 2 hired security guards, whose presence felt like a slap in the face in a town where no one ever locked their doors. He looked at me with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, the same hollow, entitled expression he'd worn since we were children, back when he was the golden son, and I was just the daughter who had to work for every scrap of attention. Mom was clear. Cassidy, he said, his voice flat and devoid of the grief he was supposed to be feeling. You aren't a Moore anymore. You don't belong inside. I looked past him, toward the large bay window of the parlor. There she was, Lydia Moore, my biological mother. The saint of Silver Creek sat rigid in her pearls, her face a mask of practiced sorrow that she'd spent 16 years perfecting. She didn't look at me, she looked through me. As if I were a piece of damaged furniture, she'd finally managed to move to the basement. As an estate appraiser, I spend my days determining the value of things, the history of a grain of wood, the authenticity of a silver seal. But standing there, barred from my own father's funeral, I realized that to the woman who gave me life, my value was 0. However, what Lydia didn't realize was that I wasn't just standing there with a broken heart. I was holding a manila folder, thin enough to be overlooked but heavy enough to dismantle her entire 16-year charade. I stood there, the manila folder clutched against my chest like a shield, feeling the condensation from the damp air seep into the paper. My name is Cassidy Moore. I'm 30 years old, and for the past 8 years, I have made a living as a senior estate appraiser. In my world, I am paid to see through the surface. I spend my days in dusty attics and marble-floored libraries, running my fingers over the grain of mahogany and checking the hallmarks on silver. I am trained to distinguish the priceless from the worthless, the genuine article from the high-end counterfeit. I can tell you within seconds if a Queen Anne chair is an original or a 19th century reproduction designed to fool an untrained eye. I know how to spot the cracks in a veneer before they are visible to anyone else. It is a profession of truth, and perhaps that is why I am finally standing here today, because I have spent my entire life living inside a family that was nothing more than a masterfully crafted lie. My father, Thomas Moore, was the one who taught me the language of things. He was an architect who believed that the bones of a house told you everything you needed to know about the people living inside it. He was the one who built the porch swing where I learned to read, and he was the one who planted the lavender garden that my mother eventually ripped out with the cold precision of an executioner. He was a man of quiet integrity, a man who believed in the weight of a promise. But sitting inside that funeral home, surrounded by the floral arrangements and the hushed, performative grief of the town, was the woman who had spent 16 years convincing the world that I was the one who had abandoned him. Lydia Moore, my biological mother, is the saint of Silver Creek. If you walked into the local community center or the charity gala at the country club, you would see her at the center of every photograph. She is always dressed in soft, approachable colors, creams and pale blues, wearing those signature pearls that make her look like she has never had a selfish thought in her life. She speaks in a voice that sounds like a benediction, a voice she uses to manage the perceptions of everyone around her. She has built an empire out of her sacrifice, portraying herself as the devoted wife who stayed, while her difficult daughter ran away to Seattle without a backward glance. She has spent nearly 2 decades curating a narrative where she is the victim of my stubbornness. But as I stood by those iron gates, ignored by the guards she had hired to keep me out, I realized that Lydia's greatest talent wasn't charity. It was the architecture of exclusion. She didn't just push me out of the house, she erased the very idea of me from the record of our family. I'm going to tell you the story of how that happened. I'm going to tell you about the 16 years of silence that followed the night I left with a single suitcase and a heart that felt like it had been hollowed out with a spoon. I'm going to show you exactly how a mother can look at her own flesh and blood and decide that a polished reputation is worth more than a daughter's presence. I'm going to tell you about the phone call my father made from a hospital bed when he thought no one was listening, a call that led me to the file I am holding right now. This folder contains more than just legal documents. It contains the blueprints of a betrayal that goes deeper than I ever imagined. It is the record of how my mother and my brother, Tristan, tried to bury my father's true wishes alongside him. Before I take you back to that kitchen table in Silver Creek, where the first load-bearing wall of this lie was installed, I want to ask you something. If you've ever sat in a room full of people who were supposed to love you and felt like you were a ghost, please take a moment to like and subscribe. If you know what it's like to have your truth silenced by someone else's louder, more perfect narrative, drop a comment below with your city and the local time. I want to know who is out there listening, because for a long time, I thought I was the only one. I thought I was the problem. I thought I was the debt that my family could never quite repay. What I didn't know then, but what I am certain of now, is that the truth doesn't expire. It doesn't matter how much Sungmu settles over Silver Creek, or how many layers of paint Lydia applies to her saint persona. Paperwork doesn't have feelings, and it doesn't care about social status. My father knew that. In his final hours, he realized that the only way to save me was to leave a trail of breadcrumbs made of ink and notarized seals. He knew that Lydia would try to lock the doors. He knew she would try to bar me from the funeral. And he knew that the only thing stronger than her manipulation was the truth he had hidden in plain sight. The manila folder was cold in my hands, but it felt like fire against my skin. Within those pages was the evidence of every forged signature, every manipulated medical record, and every lie that Tristan and Lydia had told to consolidate their power. I wasn't just here to say goodbye to my father. I was here to finish the work he started. I was here to determine the real value of the Moore legacy, and I was starting with the woman in the pearls. Lydia had 16 years to tell her story. Now, it was my turn to tell mine, and I was going to make sure every word landed exactly where it was meant to. The Saint of Silver Creek was about to find out that when you build a house on a foundation of lies, it only takes one honest person with a file to make the whole thing come crashing down. I took a deep breath, the damp November air filling my lungs, and I looked at Tristan one last time. He thought he had won. He thought the gates were enough. He didn't realize that I had already spent years studying the structural integrity of his world, and I knew exactly which pillar to pull first. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the night the lavender died, and the day I realized that my own mother had decided I was no longer an heir, but an inconvenience. The memory of Silver Creek Manor doesn't begin with the polished, sterile museum it is today. It begins with the scent of raw cedar and the fine, golden dust that danced in the shafts of sunlight in my father's workshop. Long before Lydia Moore became the Saint of Silver Creek, she was a woman who looked at my father's calloused, grease-stained hands with a disgust she barely bothered to hide. My father, Thomas, was a man who spoke through the grain of the wood. He used to say that a house should breathe with the people inside it, that every joint and beam was a promise made to the future. He spent 35 years with the same pair of steel-toed boots, coming home at 6:00 p.m. to scrub the grit from his palms with that orange soap that smelled like gasoline and citrus. To him, I was his apprentice, the girl who understood that the structural integrity of a building mattered far more than the color of its shutters. But in the eyes of my mother, Lydia, I was a flaw in her carefully curated blueprints. There is a specific kind of invisibility that comes from being the child who works quietly in the background while the spotlight is reserved for someone else. In our house, that spotlight belonged to Tristan. My brother was 3 years older and came out of the womb performing. He was the one Lydia took to every garden party and church social. the one she groomed to be the face of the Moore family. Tristan was golden, a boy who could talk his way out of any trouble and into any heart, while I was the quiet one, the daughter with her nose in a biology textbook or a drafting manual during Thanksgiving. Lydia didn't just prefer him, she invested in him, treating his every whim as a royal decree while my needs were filed away as inconveniences. I remember the state science fair in the 8th grade. I was the only student from our district to qualify, a feat I had achieved by spending months studying the load-bearing capacities of ancient stone arches. That same weekend, Tristan had a community theater performance a bit part in a local comedy. I stood in that gymnasium in Portland, my second-place ribbon clutched in my hand, looking at the rows of empty chairs where my parents should have been. When I finally got home, my father glanced at the ribbon and muttered, "That's nice, Cass," before returning to the blueprints Lydia had forced him to review. My mother didn't even look up. She was too busy helping Tristan remove his stage makeup, telling him he was destined for Broadway. That was the moment I realized that being the daughter they noticed was impossible, so I decided I would be the daughter they couldn't ignore. Lydia's manipulation was never loud. It was an architecture of subtle erosion. She had a way of framing my existence as a debt I could never fully repay. From the time I was 10, she would sit at the kitchen table with a stack of bills and sigh just loud enough for me to hear. "Do you know how much your tuition costs this family, Cassidy?" she'd ask, her eyes never leaving the ledger. She made sure I felt every cent of the space I occupied. By 15, I was working 3 separate jobs just to pay for my own school supplies and the winter coats Tristan would outgrow and refuse to pass down. While Tristan was given a new car for his 16th birthday, I was given a bus pass and a list of chores. I didn't complain because I genuinely believed I owed them for the privilege of being a Moore. The dynamic was a masterpiece of psychological engineering. Lydia played the role of the sacrificial mother so well that the town of Silver Creek saw her as a martyr for having a daughter as difficult and aloof as me. She would tell the neighbors at the grocery store, "Cassidy is just so in her own world, we barely see her," shaking her head with a practiced, weary smile. She was planting the seeds for my eventual exile years before it actually happened. She needed the world to believe I was the problem so that when she eventually cut me out, it would look like a desperate act of self-preservation rather than a calculated theft. My father saw it, but he was a man who had traded his voice for peace a long time ago. He stayed in his workshop, the smell of sawdust, his only refuge from the cold, performative saintliness that Lydia had installed in the main house. He would look at me sometimes, his eyes heavy with a guilt he couldn't name, and give me a small, secret nod. It was our only shared language, the recognition that we were both being slowly erased from our own lives. I didn't know then that he was already keeping a record, that his silence wasn't surrender, but a way to buy time. I just knew that the house on Miller Hill was no longer mine, and the woman who had given me life was the one holding the hammer, ready to shatter the foundation of everything I thought I knew about family. While my father found a quiet, honest sanctuary in the scent of cedar and sawdust, my mother, Lydia Moore, was busy curating a very different kind of temple, one built of cold marble, polished reputations, and the blinding light of public approval. If my father represented the hidden, structural integrity of a home, Lydia was the ornate, artificial veneer designed to hide the cracks in the foundation. To the world, she was the saint of Silver Creek, the woman who sat on every nonprofit board and chaired the Silver Creek Hope Foundation's annual gala with a level of grace that felt almost divine. She moved through our town in a cloud of cream silk, always punctuated by her signature pearl earrings, smooth white spheres the size of dimes that seemed to catch the light and reflect it back, ensuring she was always the brightest thing in the room. But those pearls were more than just jewelry. They were symbols of the wealth and power she used as a shield against anyone she deemed less than. Lydia viewed the world through a rigid lens of hierarchy, a master of the elite contrast where people were either useful for her social standing or entirely invisible. She didn't just walk into a room, she possessed it, shaking hands and offering smiles that I eventually realized weren't really smiles at all. They were performative, Stiff gestures of hospitality that felt like a locked gate, a way of keeping people at a distance, while making them feel as though they had been blessed by her attention. It was the saint's way of reminding you exactly where you stood in her architectural plan for the town. In Lydia's world, the Moore name wasn't just a family identifier. It was a three-generation deep brand of real estate development and local power. She spoke of our legacy as if it were a bronze plaque at the country club, a sacred thing that had to be protected from the unworthy at any cost. This was the woman who could look at a community clinic, a place where real people actually found help, and call it interesting in a tone that suggested it was a curious little ant farm rather than a necessary service. Her snobbery, was quiet but absolute. She had a profound contempt for anything that required getting one's hands dirty, including my father's lifelong craft. She looked at the working class, the plumbers, the lunch ladies, the very people who kept Silver Creek running, and saw them as nothing more than background noise, people who belonged in the back or near the service entrance of life. Then there was Tristan, the golden son and the true beneficiary of Lydia's obsession with appearances. Tristan was the elite half of her masterpiece, a man who possessed a jawline that looked like it had been designed in a corporate boardroom and a smile that convinced investors to overlook his lack of substance. Lydia treated him as the heir to the Moore acquisitions, the future of the family name, and the center of her universe. She was so busy admiring the frame she had built around him that she refused to see the rot inside. Tristan was her rehearsal for a perfect future, and she spent years testing how far she could push the boundaries of reality to keep his golden image intact. Every time I tried to speak up about the reality of our family, the debt Tristan was accruing, or the way Lydia was draining my father's spirit, she would turn that rehearsed, patient face toward me. She was a master of looking reasonable while saying the most unreasonable, cruel things. She would sigh, a sound of profound disappointment, and imply that I was simply emotional or stressed, a tactic used to gaslight me into believing that my perception of the truth was a symptom of my own instability. She used this calm, boardroom-ready voice to justify moving my father's oldest friends to the back of the room during events, or reprinting programs to erase the names of those she felt looked poor or inappropriate next to the town's elite. Lydia didn't just want to be rich. She wanted to be the moral architect of Silver Creek, the woman who decided who mattered and who was enough. She built a world where important guests, like the Hendersons or the Porters, were placed front and center, while the Marshalls, my father's true family, were relegated to table 14, tucked against the kitchen door and the trash can. She believed she had the right to decide where people belonged, to move them around, like chess pieces, to fit her vision of a perfect family portrait. This was the power I was up against: a woman who used charity as a cloak, a son who used charm as a mask, and a social standing that acted as a fortress against the truth. I was the only one who saw the blueprints, and I was the only one who knew that the saint was actually the one holding the demolition hammer. The erosion of our family's foundation didn't happen with a sudden tremor. It was a creeping rot, a slow-motion demolition disguised as a medical crisis. It began on a Wednesday in late autumn, a day when the Oregon mist felt particularly thick, clinging to the windows of Silver Creek Manor like a shroud. My father, Thomas, the man whose hands were once a testament to strength and precision, collapsed in his workshop. It was heart failure, a mechanical breakdown of a man who had spent 30 years carrying the emotional weight of a house he no longer truly owned. Lydia stepped into the crisis, not with the frantic desperation of a wife, but with the cold, strategic poise of a CEO during a hostile takeover. While I was driving 3.5 hours from Seattle, my heart hammering against my ribs, Lydia was already triaging our lives. By the time I arrived at the hospital, she had already established herself as the sole commander of the narrative. She stood in the ICU hallway, her cream-colored coat unblemished, and her pearls gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, looking like a saint who had just descended to manage the chaos. She didn't hug me. She offered a rehearsed, tight smile, the kind that isn't really a smile, and told me I was emotional and should let her handle the heavy lifting. The isolation began immediately and surgically. Lydia started by purging our history, beginning with those who knew the truth of the Moore house before she had renovated its soul. Mrs. Martha, our housekeeper, who had been there since I was 10, the woman who had baked my birthday cakes when Lydia was too busy with charity auctions, was the first to be discarded. Lydia cited budgetary restructures and the need for privacy during a family tragedy, but I knew better. Martha had seen too many of the cracks in the veneer. She was a witness to the subtle humiliations Lydia had heaped on my father for years. With Martha gone, the house became a fortress where only Lydia's version of reality was allowed to exist. Whenever I tried to visit my father, I was met with an architecture of exclusion. Lydia managed his hospital room, the way she managed her nonprofit boards, with a rigid guest list and a no-visitors policy that somehow only seemed to apply to me. She would waylay me in the hallway, her voice dropping into that sweet, manipulative register she reserved for public performance, telling me that Thomas was agitated, or that seeing me reminded him of the years of distance, implying that my very presence was a medical risk. She turned my father into a ghost while he was still breathing, and she turned me into the haunting figure responsible for his decline. Then came the financial garrote. One evening, after a grueling shift at the hospital where she had played the devoted wife for the benefit of the Hendersons and the town council, Lydia sat me down in the parlor. She didn't ask how I was doing. She laid out a series of ledgers and documents on the coffee table. She spoke of duty and the burden of legacy, words she used as tools of entrapment. Tristan's latest acquisition, a luxury real estate venture that was nothing more than a glorified pyramid scheme, had collapsed, leaving a trail of debt that threatened the Moore name. Lydia looked me in the eye, her expression one of practiced, sacrificial sorrow, and told me that it was my responsibility to save the family. She leveraged my father's mounting medical bills like a weapon, suggesting that if I didn't provide the capital to cover Tristan's failures, we wouldn't be able to afford the best possible care for my father. She made me feel like every cent I had earned in Seattle was a debt I owed to her for the privilege of being born a Moore. It was a masterclass in emotional and financial manipulation. She was forcing me to fund the very brother who was currently helping her erase me. I was being asked to carry the heavy lifting of Tristan's incompetence while being denied a seat at my father's bedside. Every time I pushed back, Lydia would sigh, a sound of profound disappointment that echoed through the empty hallway where my mother's Waihung, lavender, used to grow. She would tell me that I was being selfish and aloof, a tactic used to ensure I stayed in the basement of our family hierarchy. I was being squeezed between the guilt of a difficult daughter and the duty of a successful professional, all while Lydia stood at the center of the room, her pearls catching the light, perfectly composed as she dismantled my father's life and my future, one notarized signature at a time. I didn't know it yet, but the saint was already drafting the final paperwork to make my disappearance permanent. The monitor flatlined at 3:12 a.m. In the ER, they call it a code, but in that private room at the end of the hallway, it was just the sound of a legacy ending in a long, mechanical sigh. Lydia didn't collapse. She didn't even smudge her mascara. She simply looked at her gold watch, then at the clock on the wall, and finally at me, with an expression that was as clinical as the room itself. It was in that silence, thick with the smell of antiseptic and dying flowers, that the naked truth finally emerged from behind her pearls. She waited exactly 4 minutes, I know because I tracked every tick of the second hand, before she pulled me into the sterile, blue-white light of the consultation room to dismantle the last 16 years of my life. The mask of the Saint of Silver Creek didn't just crack, it was removed with surgical precision. She sat across from me, her cream-colored silk suit unblemished, and spoke in that terrifyingly calm boardroom register that signaled the end of any pretense of maternal love. "Cassidy, sweetheart," she began, the word sweetheart landing like a cold stone in a stagnant pond. "We need to talk about the optics of the next few days. The town expects a certain level of dignity for your father's service. Tristan is already coordinating the press release with the mayor's office." She didn't mention my father's name, only the service and the press release. That was when she told me, without a single tremor in her voice, that I was not to attend the funeral. She explained, with the detachment of a landlord evicting a tenant, that my presence would complicate the narrative of the devoted, perfect family she had worked so hard to build in my absence. To her, I was an embarrassment, a reminder of a past she had surgically removed to make room for Tristan's golden future. She described my years in Seattle not as an escape from her manipulation, but as a betrayal of the Moore brand. I stood there, my throat stinging from the dry hospital air, realizing that I wasn't just being barred from a ceremony. I was being erased from the record of my own father's life. "You've lived your life as an outsider, Cassidy," she said, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle in her sleeve with a hand that was as steady as a predator's. "It would be hypocritical to stand in the front row now. You aren't a Moore. You're just a ghost from a chapter we've finally closed." This was the naked truth of our house. My mother didn't see a grieving daughter. She saw damaged inventory that needed to be written off before the public audit began. Then came the final, physical blow, the symbolic act of dispossession that confirmed I was officially in exile in my own hometown. Lydia held out her hand, palm up, waiting. "The house keys, Cassidy. Silver Creek Manor needs to be secured for the estate transition. You won't be needing them anymore." I felt the weight of the brass key in my pocket, the one my father had given me when I was 16, the day he told me I would always have a place at Miller Hill. As I handed it over, the metal felt like ice against my skin. The saint didn't say thank you. She just dropped the key into her designer clutch with a soft, metallic click, the sound of a door being locked from the inside. She had taken my room, my mother's lavender, and now, my right to say goodbye. Tristan was already standing by the nurse's station, his face a mask of practiced solemnity as he checked his phone, likely calculating the resale value of my father's antique workshop tools. He didn't look at me once. In that moment, the structural failure of my family was complete. I was no longer an heir, no longer a daughter, and certainly no longer a Moore, in the eyes of the law Lydia had written for herself. I was a ghost being evicted from the only haunting I had ever known. But as I watched Lydia's elevator doors close, I felt a cold, architectural clarity settle over me. She thought she had secured the estate by taking the keys, but she forgot one fundamental rule of my profession. An appraiser knows that the most valuable things in a house are the ones people try the hardest to hide behind the walls. She had 16 years of lies. I had a manila folder and a truth that was about to find its way home. I followed Tristan down the long, echoing corridor of the hospital's private wing, my footsteps sounding hollow against the polished linoleum. Even in my state of shock, I was trying to find a path toward a peaceful resolution. I had been trained as a professional to navigate high-stakes negotiations over estates worth millions, and I thought perhaps foolishly that I could apply that same logic to the wreckage of my own family. I caught up to him in the small, sun-drenched waiting lounge reserved for the elite donors, a room filled with plush velvet chairs and a quietness that felt expensive. "Tristan, wait," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for a shred of the brother I used to play with in the cedar shavings of our father's workshop. I tried to speak to him as the adult I had become, proposing a compromise that would protect the Saint of Silver Creek persona Lydia so desperately cherished. "I won't cause a scene. I won't stand in the front row or talk to the press. If you just give me 1 hour, one private hour in the parlor at the manor, before the viewing begins, I'll stay away from the church entirely. I just want to say goodbye to him and the house he built." I was attempting to settle this peacefully, offering to vanish into the shadows of Seattle as long as I could have that one moment of closure. But as Tristan turned to face me, I saw that the golden sun was gone, replaced entirely by a carbon copy of Lydia's cold, calculated arrogance. He didn't just reject my offer. He laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the sterile quiet of the lounge. "You really don't get it, do you, Cass?" he said, leaning back against a mahogany side table, looking at me as if I were a piece of damaged inventory he was eager to write off. "This isn't a negotiation. You made your choice 16 years ago when you decided your integrity was more important than this family's reputation. Mom is right. You're an outsider. You're a ghost who only shows up when there's a scent of an inheritance in the air." The humiliation was deliberate and surgical. He began to mock my professional standing, the very career I had built to prove I was enough. To Tristan, being an estate appraiser was nothing more than being a glorified scavenger, someone who spent their life counting other people's junk because I couldn't build anything of my own. He reinforced the narrative Lydia had spent nearly 2 decades weaving, that I was the stubborn child who had abandoned a devoted father, and that my sudden appearance was a insult to his memory. "We've already started clearing out the workshop," he added, his voice dropping into a tone of casual cruelty that made my blood run cold. "Mom wants to convert it into a gallery for her foundation. Most of those old tools are rusted anyway. We're donating them or tossing them out. There's no room for sentimental junk in the new Silver Creek Manor." That was the moment the last load-bearing wall of my hope collapsed. I realized that my attempt at compromise had failed because there was no middle ground with people who viewed my existence as a liability. They didn't want a quiet funeral. They wanted a total erasure of the daughter who knew the truth about the rot beneath the veneer. Tristan wasn't just being difficult. He was actively participating in the demolition of my father's legacy. As he checked his gold watch, likely an acquisition from my father's dresser, I felt a shift in my own architectural plan. I had approached them with a white flag, trying to be the good daughter one last time, but they had used that flag to try and blindfold me. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and saw the naked truth. There would be no peaceful resolution. There would be no private hour of mourning. Lydia and Tristan had spent 16 years building a fortress of lies, and they believed their position made them untouchable. "I tried, Tristan," I said, and this time, my voice was as cold and sharp as a slate tile. "I tried to do this the way Dad would have wanted, but you and Lydia don't want a family. You want a curated exhibit, and you've forgotten that, as an appraiser, I don't just look at what's on the pedestal. I look at what's hidden in the crawl space." He rolled his eyes and turned his back on me, dismissed me as if I were a failed investment. The Saint and the Golden Sun were convinced they had won, that they had secured the keys and the narrative. They didn't realize that by rejecting my compromise, they had forced me to open the only door they couldn't lock, the truth. I walked away from that lounge, the smell of his expensive cologne lingering like a bad memory, and I felt the weight of the manila folder in my bag. The time for peace was over. The time for the master template of my father's real wishes had begun. I walked out of that hospital, the automatic glass doors closing behind me with a sharp hiss that sounded like a final judgment. The Oregon mist had turned into a cold, persistent drizzle, the kind that blurs the lines between the sky and the towering pines of Silver Creek. My boots clicked against the wet pavement as I moved toward the shadows of the far parking lot, the manila folder feeling like a lead weight in my hands. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was an appraiser walking onto a site of total structural failure. In the dim light of a street lamp, I found a familiar silhouette leaning against a rusted sedan. It was Aunt Martha, the housekeeper Lydia had discarded like a broken tool. Beside her stood a woman in a white coat, her arms crossed, her face a mask of clinical outrage. This was Dr. Evelyn Cross, the physician who had fought for my father behind the scenes. They didn't offer comfort, they offered the final trigger, the piece of evidence that would finally bring the Saints' fortress crashing down. Dr. Cross didn't waste time with preamble. She spoke with the steady, measured tone of a professional reading a lethal diagnosis. "Cassidy, your mother didn't just manage your father's care," she said, her voice cutting through the damp air like a scalpel. She handed me a redacted incident report on hospital letterhead. "Lydia actively blocked the cardiac specialist we paged. She cited insufficient funds despite the Moore family's public donations, and she signed a Do Not Resuscitate, DNR, order at 11:18 p.m., while Thomas was still cognitively capable of making his own decisions. This wasn't a medical choice. It was an administrative execution designed to preserve the estate for Tristan." My chest tightened as I realized the depth of the rot. Lydia hadn't just been cold, she had been active. But Dr. Cross wasn't done. A man stepped out from the driver's side of the car. Elias Thorne, the Tham 22, private detective my father had secretly hired 2 years before his death. He handed me a second file, what he called the black file. I've been tracking the architecture of your mother's deception for 18 months, Elias said, his voice as dry as old parchment. He pointed to a document recorded at the county office just 6 days before my father died. It was a deed transfer for Silver Creek Manor, leverage for a $280,000 mortgage. The signature is a masterpiece, Cassidy. It was traced from your father's old architectural blueprints while he was too medicated to lift a pen. I stared at the numbers $280,000. The money hadn't gone toward my father's specialist or the best possible care Lydia had bragged about. It had been funneled into a separate account to cover Tristan's gambling losses in Portland and a series of failed real estate acquisitions that Lydia had tried to bury beneath the Moore family name. They were cannibalizing the very house they claimed to be protecting, stripping the copper pipes out of the family legacy while my father was still breathing. Finally, Martha reached into her coat and pulled out a bundle of letters, tied with a simple piece of baker's twine. Her hands were shaking. I found these hidden in the back of the roll-top desk, Cassidy. Lydia told your father you never answered his calls. She told him you'd moved out of state and didn't want to be contacted. I opened the top envelope, recognizing my father's shaky, late-stage handwriting. Cassidy, I'm sorry I was always late. I'm sorry I let her build a wall between us. The house is yours. I've made sure of it. Don't let her take what's yours. The Saint of Silver Creek had built an architecture of deception, but she had forgotten one fundamental rule. A house is only as strong as its load, bearing walls. The final trigger wasn't just Tristan's insults at the hospital or the way they had barred me from the viewing. It was the realization that my mother didn't just want me gone. She wanted me dead to the narrative so she could consume the estate in silence. I looked at the manila folder, the black file, and my father's letters. For 29 years, I had been taught to believe I was the debt this family couldn't afford. Now, I saw the truth. They were the ones in the red. They were the ones who had over-leveraged their morality, and the audit was coming. What do you want to do, Cassidy? Martha asked, her eyes fixed on the hospital where my brother was likely still calculating his commission. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over me, the kind of calm you feel in the ER right before a code. I'm going to do what any good appraiser does, I said, my voice steady as a plumb line. I'm going to show the town of Silver Creek exactly what the saint has been hiding behind those pearls. We're going to the will reading on Monday, and I want the Hendersons and the town council in the room. The architecture of their lies was complete, but they had left a paper trail a mile wide, and I was going to follow it until there was nothing left of Lydia Moore's reputation but dust. I wasn't just a ghost anymore. I was the person with the file, and the saint was about to find out that the truth doesn't just show up, it demands payment. I did not confront Lydia immediately. I did not storm back into that hospital room or scream at Tristan in the hallway. Instead, I sat in the dim, flickering light of my rental car, the engine humming a low, steady rhythm as the rain drummed against the roof. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over me, the kind of professional distance I maintain when I'm auditing a multi-million-dollar estate. For 29 years, I had been the difficult daughter, the aloof outsider, and the debt that couldn't be repaid. But as I gripped the manila folder, I realized I was no longer a victim. I was the auditor, and the Saint of Silver Creek was about to face a total forensic collapse. I spent the next 48 hours gathering my weapons. My first call was to Margaret Calloway. When her voice came through the line, calm, measured, and possessing the authority of someone who had read 10,000 wills, I felt the first real load-bearing wall of my counterstrike click into place. We didn't talk about feelings or the ache in my chest. We talked about probate law, cognitive evaluations, and notarized seals. We spent hours on a secure line, cross-referencing the black file from Elias Thorne with the original deeds Margaret had kept in her vault for 30 years. I was triaging my mother's lies. I meticulously organized the evidence into what I called the architecture of justice. I had the nursing logs from Dr. Cross that documented the exact timestamps of my father's medication proof that Lydia had presented him with the first will while his mind was a fog of pharmaceutical impairment. I had the lean search from Elias, showing the $280,000 mortgage that Lydia had secured using a traced, forged signature. And I had the letters Martha had saved the smoking gun of 16 years of intentional isolation. Every document was a brick, and every brick was being laid to seal the exit for the woman who had evicted me from my own family. Choosing the stage was the most critical strategic decision. I could have gone to the police immediately, but I knew Lydia's power in Silver Creek was built on appearances and reputation. To destroy her, I had to dismantle her where she felt most untouchable. At the formal will reading in attorney Frank Garrett's office, Garrett was her lawyer, a man who represented the town's elite, and his office was the parlor where she expected to collect the final spoils of her long-game deception. I wanted the Hendersons and the Porters, her donors and social peers, to be the audience to her moral collapse. I didn't want a private apology. I wanted a public deconstruction of the saint. Throughout that weekend, I maintained a clinical voice. I answered Lydia's administrative texts with short, factual replies, letting her believe I was still the stubborn daughter hiding in a cheap motel. I watched from a distance as she played the role of the grieving widow, coordinating the optics of my father's legacy with Tristan. They thought they had secured the keys. They thought the keys of Silver Creek were in their pockets because they had taken the physical ones. They forgot that I am an appraiser. I don't need the keys to know what's inside the vault. On Sunday evening, I sat on the edge of the motel bed, the same white button-down shirt and black slacks I would wear to the meeting laid out like a uniform. I looked at the photograph of my father in the manila folder, the one Lydia had tried to hide in a drawer. He wasn't just a line item or a number on a bill to me. He was the man who had picked up a phone when he could barely breathe to make sure I found Margaret. My plan was ready. I had the timeline, the files, and the independent witnesses. I wasn't going into that office to beg for my seat at table 14. I was going there to reclaim the Moore name and to prove that setting a boundary isn't revenge, it's survival. As the clock on the nightstand ticked toward Monday morning, I felt no fear, only the focused, steady rhythm of a professional about to deliver a terminal diagnosis to a 16-year charade. The Saint of Silver Creek thought she was reading the final chapter. She didn't realize I was the one who had just found the real blueprints. The aftermath of that meeting didn't happen with a roar. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of everything Lydia Moore had built her saint persona upon. In a town like Silver Creek, reputation is the only currency that matters, and Lydia's account had just been frozen by the truth. Within 48 hours, the legal wheels began to grind with a terrifying, clinical precision. The $280,000 mortgage, the one Lydia had secured by tracing my father's signature while he lay dying, was flagged by the lender's fraud department. Since the title was now officially disputed, the funds were frozen, leaving Lydia and Tristan with a mountain of debt secured against nothing but their own deception. I didn't have to orchestrate the social exile. The town did it for me. The Hendersons and the Porters, the very important people Lydia had placed at the front of every gala, were the first to distance themselves. Jim Henderson withdrew his partnership from Tristan's latest real estate venture by Monday afternoon, citing that if a man treats his own sister like a ghost, he can't be trusted with a partner's money. By Wednesday, the board of the Silver Creek Hope Foundation met behind closed doors. Lydia wasn't fired. Small-town society is too polite for that. But she was invited to step back to focus on her family matters. Her name was removed from the program of the annual gala she had chaired for a decade. The Saint of Silver Creek had been excommunicated by the very elite she had worshipped. As for Tristan, the Golden Sun title turned into a lead weight. Without the Moore family credit to shield him, his gambling creditors in Portland finally came knocking. He was forced to sell his luxury car and move into a cramped apartment in the next county, a place far smaller than the basement room he had once forced me into. But the real karma wasn't just in the loss of money or titles, it was in the silence. The phone at Silver Creek Manor stopped ringing. The invitations stopped arriving. The woman who had spent 16 years making me disappear was now experiencing what it felt like to be truly invisible in her own town. I watched from my hotel room as a process server arrived at the manor to deliver a summons for forgery in the 3rd degree. I didn't feel the rush of revenge I had expected. Instead, I felt the quiet satisfaction of an appraiser, seeing a fraudulent piece finally removed from the gallery. The architecture of their lies had collapsed, and as the dust settled, the only thing left standing was the truth documented, notarized, and undeniable. In the world of structural engineering, there is a phenomenon called progressive collapse, where the failure of one critical support member leads to the total destruction of the entire building. That is exactly what happened to Lydia Moore's life in the wake of that will reading. I didn't need to burn the house down. I simply removed the fraudulent pillar she had used to hold up her saint persona, and the weight of her own lies did the rest. The social exile began at the Silver Creek Community Center, the very heart of my mother's power. Within 48 hours, the local board, the same people who once treated Lydia's word as gospel, issued a terse press release. They didn't mention the forgery or the black file. They simply stated that Lydia Moore was transitioning out of her leadership roles to address personal matters. It was a clinical execution of her status. I walked past the center on Wednesday morning and saw a maintenance worker removing the brass plaque with her name on it. He didn't look sad. He just looked tired, as if he were finally clearing away a piece of clutter that had been in the way for years. The Hendersons and the Porters, the elite donors Lydia had curated like prize exhibits, were the first to vanish. In a town this small, loyalty is a luxury, and Lydia's brand had become toxic. I heard from Mrs. Gable, our neighbor with the long memory, that Lydia had tried to call Carol Henderson 4 times on Tuesday night. Carol didn't answer. By Thursday, the Hendersons' landscapers were at the Moore estate, but not to work. They were there to retrieve equipment Lydia had borrowed for her foundation events, and never returned. The saint was being picked apart by the very people who had once enabled her. Tristan's downfall was even more rapid and far less dignified. Without the Moore family credit or the manor as collateral, his golden sun veneer shattered like cheap glass. His creditors in Portland, alerted by the frozen $280,000 mortgage, didn't bother with legal filings. They simply showed up. I saw him on Friday afternoon outside a local diner, arguing with 2 men in a black SUV. The bravado was gone, replaced by a frantic, sweating desperation that revealed the rot he'd been hiding for a decade. He was no longer the heir to an empire. He was a man who had over-leveraged a name that no longer had any value. But the most devastating blow came from the black file I had turned over to Sheriff Silas Reed. By Friday evening, the Silver Creek Police Department had opened a formal investigation into the forged deed and the pharmaceutical impairment documented by Dr. Cross. Lydia was served with a summons in front of her bridge club. She didn't scream or make a scene. She stood there in her pearls, clutching her designer bag, as the officer explained the charges of forgery in the 3rd degree and mortgage fraud. The clubmen, they just watched her, their expressions a mix of horror and a strange, cold relief. The manor itself felt different now, no longer a temple of saintliness, but a hollowed-out shell. I drove by one last time before the probate was finalized. The lights were dim, and the sprawling lawn my father had cared for looked overgrown and neglected. The woman who had spent 16 years making me a ghost was now living in a tomb of her own making. There were no guests, no charity planners, and no daughter to humiliate. Just a woman in a silk suit, realizing that the house she had stolen was built on a foundation that had officially flatlined. The final piece of karma arrived in a quiet phone call from Paige. She had officially moved her things out of the manor and into a studio in Portland. She told me she had spent the afternoon at the county archives, reading the real history of the Moore family. "She didn't just lie to you, Cassidy," Paige said, her voice shaking with the weight of the revelation. "She lied to all of us. She made us believe that being a Moore meant being perfect, but it really just meant being her accomplices." Lydia Moore had lost her title, her son's loyalty, and the town's respect. But more than that, she had lost the power to tell the story. I sat in my rental car, the manila folder empty, now that its contents were in the hands of the law, and I felt a profound sense of architectural peace. The progressive collapse was complete. The fraudulent structure was down, and beneath the debris, for the first time in 16 years, the ground was finally clear. The restoration of Silver Creek Manor didn't happen with a construction crew. It happened with a shovel, a bag of lavender seeds, and the courage to open the windows to let the past breathe. 3 months after the probate order was finalized, I stood in the front hallway of the house Thomas More had built with his own calloused hands. The sterile, museum-like veneer Lydia had installed was gone, sold at a quiet auction to pay off the debts Tristan had left in his wake. I had spent those weeks stripping away the cream silk and the cold marble, revealing the raw cedar and the honest brick that had been waiting 16 years to be seen again. Walking through the rooms now, the air no longer smelled of Lydia's expensive, suffocating perfume or Derek's cheap arrogance. It smelled of wood shavings, lemon oil, and the sharp, clean scent of the Pacific Northwest air blowing in from the valley. I started in the backyard. The spot where my mother's garden had been raised was no longer a patch of scorched earth. I hired a local nursery to bring back the exact variety of lavender my mother had loved, purple and silver green, humming with life by mid-July. My mother once said that the house was mine because of what my father built inside it. And as I watched the bees return to the blooms, I finally understood that he hadn't just built walls. He had built a sanctuary of love that no amount of paint could ever truly erase. I reopened the workshop on a Saturday morning. The dust was thick, but as I ran my fingers over my father's antique lathe and the rack of chisels Lydia had called sentimental junk, I felt a connection that went deeper than blood. I spent the afternoon cleaning the tools, the same way he had taught me when I was 8 years old. I wasn't just a ghost anymore. I was the architect of my own restoration. I decided then that Silver Creek Manor wouldn't be a fortress for the elite. It would be a place for the town. A scholarship fund, headquarters, and a craft school, where kids could learn the language of wood and integrity, the way I had. The boundary I set with Lydia was quiet, definitive, and immovable. She had moved into a small apartment in Portland, living off the modest monthly stipend my father had provided in his true will. She called me once, her voice brittle and stripped of its benediction-like melody, asking Kinao when she could come home to help with the renovation. I told her the truth. The door isn't locked, Lydia, but it is only open on my terms now. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the architecture of a betrayal, and the saint would have to learn to live without an audience. She has my father's name on her check, but she no longer has a seat at the table he built for me. Last week, a letter arrived in a pale purple envelope. It was from Paige. She's working at a housing nonprofit now, trying to find her own version of an honest life. She didn't ask for money or an invitation to the manor. She simply told me she had visited my father's grave and left a wreath of wildflowers. I wrote back a single note card. He hears you. Take care of yourself. It isn't a reconciliation, not yet, but it is a start, an honest foundation, where we don't have to be perfect to be real. Every Sunday evening, I sit on the porch, swing the one my father built, the summer I turned 7. I watch the sunset turn the Olympic Mountains into a tapestry of gold and pink, the exact colors of a Tuesday evening that my father never got to see from my office window. I set the table for 1, or sometimes 2, when Margaret or Martha stops by, but the count doesn't matter. What matters is that no one is sitting next to the trash. No one is being told they aren't due. Enough. My name is Cassidy Moore. I'm an appraiser, a daughter, and finally, the owner of my own life. I live in a house that smells like lavender and cedar, and I have never been prouder of the scars on its foundation. If you're listening to this, and you're sitting at a table 14 inches your own life, if you're being told you're a ghost in your own home, I want you to know that you can stand up. You don't need a miracle. You just need the truth and the courage to follow the paper trail home. You deserve a house that breathes, and you deserve a life where you are always table 1. The story of Cassidy Moore serves as a profound masterclass in moral integrity and emotional boundary setting. The central educational value lies in the distinction between appearances and structural truth. While Lydia Moore prioritized the elite contrast of her public persona, the narrative proves that a life built on a foundation of lies inevitably faces a progressive collapse when confronted with forensic evidence. Educationally, the content teaches viewers that self-worth is not a debt to be repaid to manipulative parents. It empowers the audience to recognize that Table 14 is a choice made by others, but standing up for one's sovereignty is a personal right. Furthermore, it highlights the importance of hua, documenting one's truth. Justice is most effective when supported by physical evidence and legal structure, rather than mere emotional reaction. Ultimately, the story redefines family not as a biological obligation, but as an architecture of love, a place where everyone belongs at table 1. Setting a boundary is not an act of revenge. It is the ultimate act of survival and self-respect.